But all that to say that, look, I mean, I would never argue with getting more Infinite Crisis. Sure, why not make it 9 issues, 10, or maybe 12 issues like the original Crisis,
like the original story, right?
It would have been cool. But I mean, considering that Infinite Crisis, I think specifically is a tighter story than the original one is, and I think it's better for it. I mean, I love Crisis on Infinite Earths to death, and it's important.
Excuse me?
In the overall scheme of things, its importance is absolutely much higher than Infinite Crisis is. In terms of my reading experience and the character work that is more focused on the Trinity and the growth that they all have to overcome and to experience themselves, this is more fun for me to read than Crisis on Infinite Earths. As good as it is and as impeccable as George Perez's artwork is, because there is so much happening and that invokes thousands and thousands of different worlds, and the point of view character changes virtually like every page, it feels more like homework than Infinite Crisis does. I love that story to death.
We
but
respect the take here, though. I respect the hot take.
Wow!
Go off, Rev. Go off, Rev.
Listen,
I love the hot take.
He's bringing a fire and brimstone.
This is what's great about reading comics and opinions and all that. I
mean, I like.
Look, Crisis on Infinite Earths is a masterpiece. It is and we'll cover it as such, I'm sure, on the show.
Oh baby. Oh baby.
But I mean, I think Marv Wolfman's inclusion here, particularly in the Secret Files issue, really does help to solidify the legitimacy of Infinite Crisis as a true follow-up to the original story.
I agree with that.
And it builds on things that you wouldn't necessarily think would be able to be built on, particularly when it comes to Alexander Luthor, you know?
Yep.
So I think that this is, and we also we kind of stopped talking about in issue number 6, but this moment here was a heart stopper for me, because there were rumors at the time that, and I think they were actually true, that Dan DiDio wanted to kill off Dick Grayson in this story.
Yeah.
So this looked like it was going to be the moment, and then we get the hero of the story breaking through and saving him. I mean, Connor Kent is one of my favorite additions to the DC Comics mythology of the last 25 years, in large part because of the way that he's leveraged in Teen Titans leading up to Infinite Crisis and in the main story itself. John sets up just such a sense of disjointedness. You know, we get the allusions to that in the annual, and then, you know, in actual Teen Titans issues leading up to it. But this is the story where Connor gets his time to shine by showing that he is the true Superboy. And it's his actions in issue number 6 that also end up reverberating for Earth 2 Superman by the time we get to issue number 7. What does this mean? Because it doesn't just mean that you're powerful and that you do stuff that can affect the course of worlds. There is something more to it. And Connor Kent proves himself as a true student of Superman because of the sacrifice that he makes in this story. And it's one of the things that I just absolutely love to death about it.
It's terrific. It is, yeah.
It's the decisive, Superboy's actions are the decisive blow to the ultimate plot of Alexander Luthor. And it's what leads to the new Earth that we see here. And we get that one so this is a moment too that is going to reverberate throughout 52. When we read 52, you're going to want this burned into your retinas, because Cassie Sandsmark isn't going away, and she is going to be traumatized by this. But you know who else is traumatized by it? Everyone on this page. And there's a reason for that, because this is the kind of sacrifice that they all promised no one would have to make in their place. And Connor is the one who had to do it. So I think that this moment hits with a significant amount of punch, and I'll defend it to the death.
I agree.
And you don't
I agree. I'm not saying
that like this in the original story. So Connor Kent is a top tier character in my book, and it just leads into a hell of a finale.
This is where I'll agree with you that Crisis on Infinite Earths lacks the emotional punch that this story does. That being said, sir, for what Marv Wolfman and George Perez did in those issues is by far way more coherent than what we got in this, in my opinion. Because Yes, because as a reader of someone who loves reading comics, but has not, and I have not read as many DC books as I read as Marvel books, right? Like I have read a lot of Marvel comic books, and my knowledge of DC is solid. It's not, it's not great as far as like, measured up to like my Star Wars and Marvel stuff. It's getting there because of you.
Get to your point.
It's getting there. It's getting. Well, I'm setting it up, sir. Come on.
You set it up sufficiently. Keep it going.
Thank you. I appreciate that. The thing is, Crisis on Infinite Earths gave me everything I needed without having to read any side material. I read that, but again, I could not put it down. Well, hold on. I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, well, we read it. We broke it up.
No,
hold on. I promise you, Crisis on Infinite Earths does so much. And there's a through line, and Marv Wolfman uses many different characters to bring certain points up, but it never feels like it gets away from him, in my opinion. And I think that is the problem. And that's the problem with Infinite Crisis. Infinite Crisis, the side stuff is so good that to me, when I read it with this in mind, I'm like, it's too bloated. Whereas Crisis on Infinite Earths is bloated, but at the same time, it interweaves so much, and it doesn't lack the emotional. It lacks the emotional punch that you're saying. I agree, but I don't think it needs to.
I don't know,
because it's such a groundbreaking book, in my opinion, that it doesn't need to have that emotional punch, because it really is like, whoa, like we're taking this whole concept of multiverse and we're putting it on its head and leaning into it, and doing that in a very, I think, like, again, very clear manner, because Crisis on Infinite Earths could have been a whopping mess, and it never once is, in my opinion. And I'm someone who doesn't know anything about DC characters, and I read that book, had no problem with anything. With this story, I had more knowledge now than I did reading Crisis on Infinite Earths. I can tell you right now, reading this, I was like, well, like,
Nico was going to say
at the end, not
Nico,
leading up to it.
What were you going to say, Nico?
So 2 points. One, it's funny. When it goes back to Crisis, I need the Reverend to read my life story as legend. Just to comment on 2 points. The first point, to comment on Crisis on Infinite Earths real quick. Well, I agree. Maybe the emotional punch isn't built, but maybe it depends on like who your favorite character is. But for me, and if Mr. Peter Vera is in the comics as well, or in the comments, he's always in the comics.
He's always in the comics.
He's in the comments as well. It does, I think, still to this day, and he's on record. He says this so eloquently, and I echo it. It does have the greatest heroic act by a character in DC Comics history, in my opinion. With what what Barry does. That being said, to agree with Chris, not being a big Superboy guy, I'm not sure I completely love and feel for him and love this arc at the end of the story, to where I don't know if I could read, and this is definitely on purpose hyperbole just to prove my point. I'm acknowledging that, but I don't know if I could read something of Superboy again, because I don't think I'll feel as much for it as I did with this, unless there's another story out there that packs away like this. Like, this is, to me, I haven't read a lot of Superboy, so Chris, you could tell me this, but this feels like a definitive Superboy story in terms of what it does for his character. I mean, is there anything that you think rivals this? Or,
I mean, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that there is absolutely a worthy place that Johns takes him in the future.
Okay.
No, in the sense that I don't think anything could ever overcome the emotional gut punch of seeing how he sacrificed himself here. But I mean, one of the things that I really do feel like Infinite Crisis set up such a strong semblance of who Connor Kent is and who he's supposed to be. And I was going to save these for the end, but one of the things that, Nico, you really should read if you haven't, and we should probably do a binge leading up to it, Final Crisis Legion of Three Worlds.
I haven't read that. No.
Leads us to a hell of a satisfying moment for this guy.
Oh, okay. Wow. Okay, cool.
And I mean, it's really a confluence of so many things that are built up in this story. And as a Flash fan too, you'd probably be into it. That's all I'll say.
Oh yeah.
But I mean, after that we got a new volume of Adventure Comics from Jeff Johns, and that was the first time I ever saw Francis Manipul's work. And it was Connor back in Smallville.
Mhm.
And like that was a top tier S book when it came out for very, very good reason. But it's hard to say, just because like part of that might have come from when I was reading it at the time. Having him back was very, very like powerful for me, just as a personal reading experience.
Yeah.
But all I was going to say to Paul is that I do think it's a little unreasonable to judge the execution of, at this point, what was a 20-year comic book crossover to the standards and the practices of a modern comic book crossover, because the storytelling aims are totally different and the way in which the stories are laid out are totally different. We've had 20 years. By the time we get to Infinite Crisis, we've had 20 years of
I didn't have it.
House of M's and Secret Wars and Identity Crises and Zero's Hour and all of, and you don't have.
But I'm reading these in a vacuum, essentially, Chris. I'm not, but I don't have the baggage of all those things. I have.
It's
like,
not.
for
No.
crossover,
It's not a matter of baggage. It's not a matter of continuity. It's a matter of storytelling. The storytelling.
I agree. That's what I'm saying. I don't have that
into
baggage.
An entirely different. That's not baggage.
It's not that. It's not that different. It's not that different.
It's like judging episode 4 versus the standards of cinematic filmmaking of episode 7. They're not very comparable.
A story. It's still a movie. It's not like it's like
but the
comparing
way
episode
the story
4 to like the season 2 of Mandalorian. They're two different things. It's like, how dare you compare a movie to a movie? What? It's like, come on. I mean, here, listen, I know what you're saying, and they are vastly different.
You're applying the modern standards of comic book storytelling to a story that came out in 1985, and I don't think that's a fair thing to do.
They're not, but that was in 2006. We're not talking about they're 40 years apart. They're
20 years apart. That's an eternity in terms of comic book reading.
That's not an eternity.
Pick up any random issue off the rack in 1985 and compare it to the way that a comic book looked in 2006. Totally different. And totally different manners of titles that are active in order to tell the story in different ways. You cannot compare them directly, and you're doing.
I can, and I will, because listen.
Okay, you can, but you can't do it with a degree of authority. I'll say that.
I love this.
Whoa, sir! How could you say that?
I love it.
How could you say that? Because here's the thing.
Because you're holding the standards of a 2005 story.
I'm holding the standards of a story to a story. Like
the more simplistic storytelling standards
I
of a
get
1985
what you have.
story.
If I was comparing Infinite Crisis to like All-Star Squadron in like the 50s, you're right. You'd have your point would have more merit. I'm not doing that. I'm comparing a story that it's using. Infinite Crisis is using Crisis on Infinite Earths as a basis. Okay. Yes. So, and it's basically
remember, I never disputed the importance of Crisis on Infinite Earths.
I'm not saying you did. I'm comparing the fundamental breakdowns of the story and the processes of the storytelling. It's using. It's not just.
I'll give you this. Plot wise, Crisis on Infinite Earths is far neater. There's a lot more going on, and it is laid out in a very neat way. Character wise, there is more character work in Infinite Crisis #1 than there is in all of Crisis on Infinite Earths. Significant portion of the character work, as it should be in Crisis on Infinite Earths, really goes to an arc for Barry. But there's not a significant amount of arc for other characters in the story. There's not a lot of growth from #1 to #12, except for maybe Earth 2 Superman.
But here's the problem, though. With Infinite Crisis, Chris, it starts off as a more personal story. You think you're going to get that, but you don't get it really, because there's so much going on at the end. With Crisis on Infinite Earths, it tells you automatically what's going on.
No, the tie-ins start personally.
No, I never read freaking single tie-in of Crisis on Infinite Earths. So I have no idea what happens in those. And I can tell you right now,
There's like I'm talking about Infinite Crisis. There's like 2 tie-ins.
Yeah, there's really no tie-ins to Crisis on Infinite Earths. There's
Superboy Prime's origin story, and there's an issue of Swamp Thing, and I think that's about it.
How come I always see like these big trades of Crisis on Infinite Earths?
You probably see Crisis on multiple Earths and the different crises.
Those are the JSA Justice League team ups.
But listen, my point is this though. My point remains, because Infinite Crisis starts off, you think you're going to get a more condensed story, but you don't get that really in the end. It goes all over the place. And again,
I think that's just a matter of different expectations, really.
No, hold on. If you're in a story, Chris, and you're establishing at the beginning what the rules are, and then you go off the rails a little bit, that's on the writers. That's straight up on them. I don't care about if there's, again, I'm not saying that it's bad either. This is the whole thing. I'm not even saying it's bad. I'm just saying Crisis on Infinite Earth tells you exactly what you want, what you need to know about the story. And
because it's a simpler story.
Yeah, and that's not a bad thing. It's a good thing.
Yeah, but unless you like a lot of narrative complexity and character work, then
but there's not complexity in this story. That's the
thing.
I don't think so.
There's a lot of character complexity.
What is character complexity then?
Batman,
because the fact that Batman tells what's his name he can't talk to kids
at the end.
That's not character complexity.
The Trinity's arc of being broken to finding their journey to become whole again. Connor Kent's arc of doubting himself entirely before realizing and maturing,
and he's barely even in it in the very beginning.
Those are arcs. Crisis on Infinite Earths has like 2 arcs in it.
So because someone has an arc, it automatically justifies it as being a more a better and more complex story.
Better for me, yes. More complex.
There you go. Okay. Honestly, I could say I don't think, and again, it's been a while since I read Crisis. I think it's not obviously. I think it's way more complex story character-wise of all the different motivations of the characters in that story, in my opinion. But I digress.
No, that's serving the plot. This is serving the character.
Ugh,
the plot is a means to tell sometimes, guy. Come on. Wait. Crisis on Infinite Earths was an exercise to streamline the publication universe. The aims are totally different. You're going from something that's
aims regardless. It's the execution.
To something that is more simplistic and streamlined. This works the other way around.
I think what's fascinating here is and this is deep. We're not going to get into this, but the whole thing of era comics and what is better and is the modern age too complex? Is there too much of that? It's like, what do you want out of your comic book? So for somebody like me, I like it all. I like the complex stuff, but sometimes I think this modern age, there's too much. And I do enjoy going back to the 80s. Some of those 70s stories are pretty weak, pretty simple. But I think when you get to the 80s, and I think you get to some of the middle 80s before Crisis and stuff, I mean, to me, there's nothing wrong than reading a story that is just a self-contained issue and has a lot of stuff. So I think we all have different preferences. And I agree with the both of you, actually. Like the reason that I like Crisis more, even though it's a simpler story, is I never felt at any point during this story, and I do like Superboy, but the Barry Allen moment was just a legendary, like, impactful moment. And as a 20-year-old reading that story, I had nobody to share it with, like nobody. And it was devastating to me. And the fact that they let that linger for as long as they did and never brought him back was like, it's such an iconic moment in comic book history that really you've never seen anything like that. I mean, whatever you talk about down the road, characters dying, coming back, all this, but that was something, because that Flash character, that Barry Allen, was around for a long time and a popular mainstream character. And to have him do that heroic sacrifice and stay gone.
Yeah.
was just much more impactful to me than anything I read in Infinite Crisis.
That's always going to be the
yeah,
case.
right. Exactly.
And
I think maybe it's at the time when you read it, or maybe, and again, I'm just because I'm the older guy here, but maybe going back and reading it, like, I don't think you guys could understand that impact, right? Because it was there, but it's like one of those moments where it just was crazy, like the Jason. I mean, Death in the Family was like that too a little bit, but really that was just something. I mean, and unfortunately, like I said, it was a very personal moment for me, and nobody around me cared. I had no.
On that note, real fast, what's funny is I really like doing this because it is funny. I got to go back and read this because when I tried to read this and something like Final Crisis when I was younger, I had it mixed up. This is where Wally goes away and Barry doesn't come back.
No, that's
spoiler alert till a different Crisis.
That's correct.
I had those one. It's Bart. And then he has Barry's suit. It was all this thing. It's funny that I blended those over time. I'm curious to go back to see how I'll feel about Final Crisis. But I will say I do want to add, because I don't want Chris to feel like he's on an island here. I do agree about the complexity thing. And I'm not just saying that. I do agree about the complexity thing, because if we do think about it, I wasn't around at the time, but I wasn't reading this at the time with the way I could read things now. Where they put the Trinity is very complex because of the blurring of the morality between them. Yeah, that comes a little bit from Identity Crisis, but also with the struggle between Superman and Earth 2 Superman, the way that Earth 2 Superman thinks in a very absolute way as opposed to Superman. That is a very complex idea because it is it goes back to literally a quote that I think is used well in BVS is, if you're all powerful, can you be all good? If you're all good, can you be all powerful? That stuff does scream very complex. But I also could agree with Paul, is the execution of the complexity there. I think that's within the eyes of the reader. But I will say there are a lot of complex themes with the Trinity and with the Superman stuff. On top of that, I just thought of this. Do we feel like Eisenberg's Lex was a little more like this Alexander Luthor?
Maybe
I thought that a few times. Not 100% because it's Jesse Eisenberg, but just the different, not the same type of looking Lex and everything, a little bit more of an inspired thing. I don't know.
He's still a little more contained, but let me.
Way more contained.
Let me
Chris, you have the last word.
I'm not picking a side between the Crisis on Infinite Earths and
could have fooled me.
Well, I'm a vigorous debater. That's all.
So am I.
Awesome.
I mean, Crisis on Infinite Earths is a masterpiece. This story stands on its shoulders. Those undebatable facts.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But I do think that where Infinite Crisis went by standing on the shoulders of the original story was a confluence of the maturation of the medium that had taken place over the previous 20 years.
Yeah.
You don't get the depth of character from that story because comics weren't there yet. The same way that when you read a story in the 70s that seems a little bit simplistic by today's standards, well, by today's standards, it was. But during when it was in its era, it was groundbreaking. Green Lantern, Green Arrow by Danny O'Neill and Neil Adams. You could not tell stories that have the social consciousness that comics would grow to have without them doing it first.
I don't think Connor's arc is that complex, though.
I'm not talking specifically about Connor's arc here. I'm talking about just the totality and the evolution of comic book storytelling.
There's no doubt about it. But when I look back, and this is great, we're like talking the history of comics here, but being more of a DC fan, I always felt like Marvel was more advanced and in the time. How can I put this to you guys? I always felt that like they were a little bit more relevant and ahead of their time, and they were addressing some key issues while I was reading both of them, I always felt like Marvel was
Their heroes were the first to have problems that people could relate to.
And DC was more of the euphoric kind of altruistic good versus evil. And I again, I happen to prefer DC more, the characters more. It's not that far, but when I look back and I think about Stan Lee and those guys, and they were almost telling like stories that are a bit more timeless because, like you say, Chris, they're dealing with real life human problems.
Yeah.
And that's always where they have the edge to me. Nick, I think we talk about this, right? When we go back and we reread some stuff, some of that DC stuff in the 70s and 80s is a little bit weak.
It's hard for me to read.
But when they find their groove, they find it. And when you get the guys like Doug Mensch on Batman and Gary Conway and Penny O'Neill, I mean, it's there. It's there. And Justice League, which has always been that's always been my favorite book. It's really not until I think Steve Englehart comes in around the 130s or whatever, and then George Perez winds up coming. It starts to pick up steam there, but those first issues, the Avengers is like a more advanced book, I think. But we're getting into history of comics here, but I couldn't agree with you guys more. That's what the medium is so great, and that's what. It's like watching a movie, right, from the 1940s or 50s, and it could seem dated, but yet it could be such a relevant and important movie and so influential that you don't feel it. And some movies are just completely dated, right? I mean,
absolutely.